So for this week, I wanted us to spend time in class looking at primary documents. And so I thought that I would kind of flip this week's lecture and kind of make this your Friday activity so that way we can spend time in class and I can help you look at the primary documents. So this will kind of help shape kind of what you're thinking of as far as these early English colonies go. Now, we've talked a little bit about kind of the creation of Virginia. We know that it starts with Queen Elizabeth. We know that you have this idea, which that's what's called Virginia, because she was known as the Virgin Queen, and so hence Virginia. And so she gives Sir Walter Raleigh, excuse me, she gives him a patent for Roanoke, right? Well, we know that Roanoke doesn't succeed. And then she passes away, but they still have this land, right? They still and now we can argue that, well, wait a minute, why does England get to, put a flag in the ground and say this is our land? But that's how it worked, right? So England has this assumption that they still have access to Virginia, and that's how you end up with Jamestown. And I've already kind of touched a little bit on Jamestown. The primary documents will go into a little more detail on that. Just know it was a pretty rough beginning. It was not it was not an easy place to be. A lot of people died in the process. Let me pull up for you. So I think if this works. So I pulled up kind of a Google map, essentially, of where Virginia is, where Jamestown is. So this is the East Coast, right? So you can see it's right here in the middle. So, Mexico is way down here. Canada's up here. You do have some French that are hanging out kind of in this area, right? So coming from around the Great Lakes on down the Mississippi. But right here along the coast, the English are pretty well kind of able to do their thing. Now, you do have the Dutch hanging out up here, right? So the Dutch have a presence a little bit farther to the north, but it's a little more kind of inward a little bit. And so that's kind of what you see happening, what's going on as far as the different locations. And if we zoom in, you can kind of get a sense of, kind of where Jamestown is, as well as get a sense for kind of the inlets, right? So one of the stories about the settlement of Jamestown is that they're trying to build these places on rivers. And this is going to be crucial as we get into later parts when we talk about Bacon's Rebellion. And we're talking about the fact that there are people being pushed farther to the frontier. So as people get pushed, into the interior of Virginia, they're farther away from the rivers. It's harder for them to get their product out to the ocean. They're more vulnerable to Indian attacks. And one of the stories of this period, right, and the primary documents will show you this, is that it's not all, wonderful and peaceful with Native Americans, right? So we talked about the difference between the Spanish, the French, and the English. The English have no huge desire to convert. And they tend to, because everything is about land with indentured servants and kind of the headright contracts and all that kind of thing, they keep pushing the frontier. Well, so indigenous people that maybe were willing to let them, set up camp along the coast don't like the fact that they keep coming farther inland. And so that's going to create problems. You're going to have a similar situation happening when you get up here to Massachusetts, right? So when you're up here and you have, here's Plymouth, right? And you have the English set up here, that's going to be another problem as well. Now, there's still some key differences between the New England kind of colonies and what we call the Chesapeake colonies, which are the ones that are farther down, right? That are right here around Virginia. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a context for what all of that looks like. So you've got your Chesapeake colonies, you'll have some what they call middle colonies, which are right here around Pennsylvania and New York, and then you'll have your New England colonies that are up here. And again, these are very different from each other. They have kind of different structures. So we're going to still continue to focus for a little bit on kind of these middle colonies, but we're starting to move out from kind of the earliest kind of settlements. We're going to pretty quickly start talking about the different ways in which these areas develop. So I just kind of wanted to point out that map because it helps to sometimes have a sense for where things are, right? And this map is perfectly fine in the sense that it shows you kind of what, when they first start setting up these colonies, right? I mean, you're talking huge sections of land. When they first labeled Virginia, they basically called all of this Virginia. But over time, these things kind of get carved up into other pieces. And of course, part of that's being shaped by the presence of the French and then, all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a context there, as well as to make sure you have a little bit of a sense of where Jamestown is. So one of the things that we ended last week talking about was that John Rolfe develops tobacco, right? He merges Spanish tobacco with Virginia tobacco, and he creates this product that is that grows really well there. But the problem is tobacco is labor intensive, and it's not always an attractive option to come to the New World. There's a lot of people that are kind of like scared and freaked out, and they think, oh my gosh, I could get murdered, get attacked by Native Americans. I could catch a disease. I mean, I'm more likely to get harmed by a wild animal. And so there's not this huge rush to come. Now, that doesn't mean that nobody wants to come. There are people that see this as an opportunity, that are willing to take risks. And so that's kind of one of the foundational pieces of how, that's one of the foundational pieces for how the United States gets founded, right? It's founded by a nation of risk takers, and so that's going to kind of help add to some of the unique qualities of the United States. I mean, I always say America is not exceptional except where it's exceptional, right? And so you can have these kind of traits that you can kind of see historically that come up over and over and over again. And this idea of risk taking is one of those. So you have the system of headright contracts. And in a nutshell, what a headright contract is let's say I'm somebody and I have a section of land in Virginia. Well, if I'm willing to bring people into Virginia to pay for them to travel, they will work for me to pay back their travel. And then I will get bonus land because I've brought settlers in. Right. So one of the ways in which they're trying to build the population of Virginia is by incentivizing individuals to bring other individuals over. And this is where the indentured contracts come in. And these indentured contracts there's some variation. Some of them, can last longer. Some of them can be shorter. Typically, they were about 7 years. A lot depended on what your skill set was, a lot depended on if you were being sent over because you had committed a petty crime. It was not uncommon for England to punish somebody to come to the Americas to say, hey, you're not fit for our society, so we'll send you over there and let you, try to survive there. They'll do the same thing with Australia, but they do it in America first, right? So it depends on a lot of different factors. But the gist of it is that you have, you have people coming over. They're in these contracts that are essentially requiring them to work, right? And if they get sick, if they, get hurt, or they don't do their job right, or they break the rules, they can have time added on to their contract. Okay. Now, again, not everyone's coming over with a contract because they're being punished. Some people are doing it because they don't have any opportunities back in England. Remember, England's been enclosing property, enclosing forests and pastures, and, people that don't have the resources, if a nobleman wants to get rid of his serfs because he's not making any money at that anymore, he's making more money from trade, then they may be out of options, right? So coming to North America, coming to Virginia is an opportunity for some people. And so they will sign off on those contracts. Now, those of you who are looking at indentured contracts, you'll see in some of those documents that it's not a perfect experience. It's brutal, it's hard, it's lonely. Some indentured servants are horribly mistreated. And that's something that we want to remember. It was just a dangerous environment. Now, there's some interesting differences, like women. Women were in huge demand because not women typically didn't want to come over. And kind of in contrast with, say, Spain, where Spain had, the Spanish women didn't want to come over at all. So the Spanish men kind of intermarried with indigenous women, creating mestizos, and then they married mestizos. And this is how you have kind of the creation of the Spanish colonial society, right? It's all based on assimilation. With the French, they don't bring women over, but they're not really setting up these massive towns or anything. Like these are trading outposts. You do have people that intermarry with indigenous women, but those are often, trappers or traders. Those are people that decide they want to stay here. And actually, the assimilation is kind of the other direction, where the French actually behave a lot more like the indigenous people. The Dutch, you have the Dutch bringing some family groups over, but the Dutch never make that real lasting influence, right? So all that to say that the English, they want to bring their own women over. There's not a real interest in intermarrying with indigenous women. Yes, John Rolfe does so, but note that he changes that Pocahontas changes her name. She changes the way she dresses, all that kind of stuff. She accepts, the Church of England. Like she does all these things that England would expect her to do. So kind of a different approach. So they're desperate to get women to come over here. So one of the interesting little stories about women coming to North America is that these English women, whether they're coming over because they're desperate or coming over because they got in trouble with the law, when they come over, they're in pretty high demand, right? They usually do have to, they have an indentured contract, but oftentimes they could find somebody that was willing to pay their contract off so that they could be free to get married and stuff like that. So you have an interesting kind of, like if you're talking about gender history, where women for this time period in like the 1600s have a little more power in North America than say they would have in England, where you don't have these population pressures, right? Where men aren't desperate for female company, number one, and number two, having a wife was an important partnership, right? Like it took everybody. When you're on a frontier, you don't have time to worry about gender roles, right? It takes everybody to do everything. And if you find somebody that you work well with, that you like, that you maybe even love, then this can make this environment a lot better. And so you have women being able to kind of, arrange good matches. You have many women that come from nothing that manage to become very wealthy because they end up inheriting, because the death rate in Virginia is so high. You could get married, your husband could get killed, and then you inherited his land. You could get married again, and that same, like over and over. So if you were a woman who survived, right now, and again, you've got indentured servitude, you've got disease, you've got, wars and conflicts with indigenous people, and you've got childbirth, right? And childbirth is a risky proposition during this time. So it's by no means a certainty, but I think it's kind of interesting to recognize how women fit within that indentured servant system and how they could leverage that to their advantage. Now, for a lot of men, it's not an advantage, right? They come over, if they survive what they call the seasoning process, then they might have a chance. But they work out their contract. Especially in the early years of the indentured contracts, when you finish that, you might have, you might end up with some land or some money or something like that. As contracts go on, you get less of that. And part of that has to do with that frontier pressure, right? Which is that the farther away from the coastline that you get, the harder it is to move products back and forth, and the closer you are to indigenous people. And then whenever there's a conflict, as we'll see, there's a lot of conflicts in the 1600s with indigenous people, with the Powhatan and so forth. And that's going to create its own problem, right? So it's not a perfect system. But you do definitely, from 1607 to 1620s, you do see kind of a gradual increase in immigrants coming in, English coming in, that sort of thing. Tobacco is the key crop, right? And because they have such a labor shortage, they can't get enough people in. When the Dutch land in Virginia and they have like 7, I think, African slaves or African women, I think it's just men. Or maybe it's mostly men and one woman, something like that. Anyways, when they land in Virginia, the Dutch do, they sell these slaves, right? And so this is what kind of introduces Virginia to this notion of African slavery. Now, that's not to say that they hadn't heard of slavery, because they had, but it begins to really kind of convince Virginians that this will solve our labor problem. And so you do have African slaves coming in with increasing regularity after 1619. Some of these early arrangements were actually forms of indentured contracts. In other words, the first slaves, when they were brought in, weren't bought as slaves per se, right? It was a different type of indenture contract. It was typically longer, right? Because the idea was that you had to put a lot more investment in these African slaves, as far as language, as far as teaching them things, that kind of thing. But you would have them for longer, and typically the indentured contract was not as generous, so they might not get land or something, but they usually could get their freedom if they survived the contract. And again, it's still vulnerable to, if you're sick, they add time on, that kind of thing. So I wanted to point that out, because sometimes we think that slavery begins in 1619 exactly the way it was in, say, 1860, and that is not true at all. In fact, one of the ways in which the United States is responsible for its own history is because the United States changed the form of slavery, right? They altered what slavery looked like, and that's part of what creates this problem. And so, you want to kind of keep in mind that that's the case. And so the African slaves come in, they start figuring out that, hey, we don't have to give them land. We can make them work longer. They also realize that indigenous people don't make very good servants, very good slaves. If they don't like what's happening, they can run away and you can't find them. Whereas Africans, their skin color gives them away. They don't, especially if they're traumatized from coming off of a boat, they won't want to run away right away. That doesn't make sense. Anyways, but you get the idea. So there becomes these benefits attached with African enslavement. And over time, over the 1600s, this system changes dramatically. It goes from a system that is a variation of indentured servitude to straight up slavery, with a whole different set of codes, a whole different set of laws. And they start to attach slavery to your race, right? So that if you are a person of color, then you are automatically assumed to be this, right? Assumed to be enslaved. And it even goes so far that they take, the offspring of somebody of a woman of color and a white man, and they say, well, the status, the race is inherited from the mother. And so like if the woman is enslaved and she has a child, her child is automatically enslaved. And so you have some interesting little nuances there that you see throughout the 1600s, the system of slavery in Virginia and really throughout kind of the Chesapeake and the Southern colonies really becomes much more heinous, much more Machiavellian. Like it's just not a good system. And it didn't have to be that way, because it didn't necessarily start that way. And it's important to recognize that. And again, when we think in terms of systems and how our systems put in place, this is how that system is put in place, because there are decisions made to pass laws to shape and frame the experience of enslavement. And those things are taking place in the 1600s while Virginia is trying to deal with tobacco. One thing I will point out, Virginia in 1619 also creates a representative government. Remember that Virginia is founded by the Joint Stock Company. So this is a company business. And because it's a company, they believe in shareholders, right? And so the attitude is, if you are living in Virginia and you own land, you are essentially a shareholder and you should have a say. And so it's a very different approach towards government than you see, say, in Mexico, where The Spanish monarchs have created the encomienda system and their whole viceroyalty and all this kind of stuff, different than what you have up in Canada with the French, where you have all these trading outposts, the influence of military power. So in England, with Virginia, you have this kind of sense of representation. And it's largely because the whole model for the settlement of Virginia is based on the creation of this company, right? Now, this will eventually the joint stock company is struggling financially. It struggles financially because there's some conflicts with the Powhatan, and that's draining resources. It also, part of the issue is it's a very investment heavy, right? So when you do turn a profit, it's a good profit, but it takes so long of investing, and the joint stock company just can't keep going. And so basically King James comes in, he dissolves the company, and essentially Virginia becomes a royal colony. So beginning in 1624, we start to have a transition, right, where colonies begin to become royal colonies, as opposed to kind of these de facto settlements that we see, in Jamestown, that we saw in Roanoke, we saw in Jamestown, we saw in Plymouth. You start to have kind of all of those things changing, and it's largely directed much more by the king. So it's not till the 1600s that you see that happening, but it doesn't happen in one huge swoop like you see with Spain, where Ferdinand and Isabella control everything, and their children control everything from the get-go. This is much more of a process, and so that's one of the things you'll kind of want to pick up on. So very quickly, let me run through. You've got, just because you need to have a little bit of a concept on what's happening in England, because that will have a profound impact on what happens here in the United States. So we talked about Elizabeth, right? Protestant queen, replaced King Henry, never got married, right? Her reign was pretty stable, pretty prosperous. Yes, England was a small upstart country until after the Spanish Armada. But so she's known, the Elizabethan period is known as really kind of a good period in English history. But because she passes away in 1603, there's no more Tudors, right? So she has made an arrangement with the Stuarts in Scotland, okay? And I don't want to bore you with the whole Plantagenet War of the Roses, but there's a connection back there. Needless to say, the Stuarts become the monarchs of England. And so one part of this arrangement was that James Stuart would give up his Catholicism, become Church of England. That's going to matter because there's always going to be this sense that the Stuart monarchy is still really Catholic, right? And not really, like the kings aren't. Now, the issue is they often marry Catholic women, and those women typically don't want to participate with the Church of England. That creates tension. I mean, so you've got kind of these lingering religious issues that go back to this issue, to the Protestant versus Catholic idea. And so he has a tense relationship with Parliament. They muddle along okay. But it's a little bit uncomfortable, right? The Stuarts struggle to kind of yield power to Parliament. And little interesting side note, James I is big about witch hunting, right? So if you think about the Salem witchcraft trials, part of the origin of that is that the Stuarts were particularly paranoid, I guess is the word to say, about witchcraft, right? I have to find a podcast about that because it's really interesting. And so then when James dies, he's replaced by Charles I, right? Charles I, again, I mean, he was raised Catholic by his mother. When he becomes king, he gives up Catholicism, becomes Church of England, but he's not very good at not complaining about it, right? And his wife is a very devout Catholic. And he really wrestles with Parliament, right? He doesn't like the controls that Parliament puts on him financially. So he's constantly dissolving Parliament. And so basically he rules for a number of years without Parliament even in place. And he uses a variety of kind of legalistic tricks to kind of spend money. And this eventually triggers what is essentially an uprising among the parliament. And this ends up resulting in the English Civil War. Now, what's notable about the English Civil War is, number one, that it's parliament against kind of nobility. So you have a little bit of that tension. But you also have the rise of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell will come in and he will essentially make himself a dictator. He calls himself the Lord Protector, but he's a dictator. And he's very strict religious. He's a Puritan. So he's not Church of England, right? He believes in this Calvinistic, very strict personal piety, very strict religious beliefs. The theater is bad. I mean, even celebrating Christmas is bad. Like, you're not supposed to do those things because that detracts from your worship of God. I mean, it's just very, very legalistic, very fundamentalist kind of religious beliefs. And he kind of forces this on the whole country. And so Cromwell manages to hold on to power. But once he dies, nobody wants his son. Nobody, basically the parliamentarians go, oh, well, yeah, about that. Ugh. And so they basically reach out to the Stuarts and kind of have what they call the Restoration, right? And so the Restoration period is going to happen with Charles II. And so Charles II is going to come in. And then his reign is fairly calm because everybody was pretty fed up with Cromwell. And one of the interesting things, which I forgot to mention before, Charles I gets beheaded, right? And there's this kind of, Cromwell says, oh, I didn't tell them to do that. And the men, anyways, there's kind of this debate about whether Cromwell actually gave the order or not. But so Charles II comes in, and so there's he's focused a lot on trying to smooth things over. He's kind of known as the party king because it's all about reopening the theaters and having Christmas again and having all those things that Cromwell had put an end to. So then when he passes away, James II becomes king. Now, James is the brother to Charles. Charles, I believe, he doesn't have any sons, maybe, or does he not even have any legitimate children? It's hard to keep track. The Stuarts kind of played the field a little bit. So the brother to Charles II becomes king, and he has a couple of daughters, Mary and Anne. And he kind of has some baggage about what happened to his dad, Charles I. So he doesn't get along very well with Parliament, and they're starting to have some tensions, and the Parliament's nervous that he's going to end up with, I think he has a son with a Catholic wife, and they're concerned anyways, there's all this kind of interior, like, monarchical drama. So Parliament essentially reaches out to William and Mary, William of Orange and Mary Stuart, and they say, hey, we would like for you to come over and be king and queen because you're good Protestants and all that kind of stuff. Well, William and Mary take advantage of that. They come over with William of Orange's army, and essentially they become king and queen. James II leaves, and so you have him, kind of disappearing from that. So you have kind of a peaceful transfer of power. So William and Mary, again, Mary is a part of the Stuarts, but William is from the Netherlands. When part of them becoming in power is they negotiate away some of this power. And when they do that, what you're going to see is that you have a much stronger parliament. So one of the things you want to keep in mind as we're moving into the 1700s is that the crown doesn't have the power that it used to have. That part of William and Mary becoming the monarchs is they agree to share some power with Parliament. And so it changes the structure of things. And that's important to know because when we start getting into the 1700s and looking at the colonial complaints about taxation and how the king is governing them, we have to remember that it's not just the king, that Parliament has power too. And so that there's kind of an interesting nuance there. William and Mary pass away and they don't have any children. So Anne becomes the queen. This is Queen Anne. If you've ever seen the movie The Favorite, it's about her. She doesn't have any living children. And so when she passes away, This is when they invite the Hanovers and the Hanoverian monarchy. And this is where King George comes from. So it's the Hanoverians that the current Queen Elizabeth comes from. So the Stuart monarchy, that whole Plantagenet, 100 Years' War of the Roses stuff, that comes to an end with the death of Queen Anne. And so some interesting little things going on there with the monarchy. And I put on here, why does it matter? Well, it matters because you need to understand there's a lot of political chaos. There's, musical chairs with the monarchy, and you've got an English Civil War. And the result of all of this chaos is that England is much more concerned with what's happening at home than what's happening in the colonies. So the colonies are kind of neglected. This is what we call the period of benign neglect, where they pass some rules, but nobody really enforces them. And basically the American colonies do whatever they want, right? And so that is going to play a role in what's happening. In addition, because the Stuarts are kind of in power, not in power, in power, and because you're dealing with these kind of leftover religious developments, you have a lot of kind of political wrangling. And that's going to play a role in how the crown starts to give out land in the New World, right? So giving out that land is going to begin to change the way change the way the colonies are run. And so that's kind of what's interesting about it. It starts in 1624 with James making Virginia a royal colony, and it just kind of continues from there. And again, a lot of these Stuart monarchs will give away land as a favor, right? As a payback for people helping them when they were in exile, that kind of thing. So again, you have lots of political chaos in the 1600s as far as England is concerned. And that is crucial to understanding how the colonies develop. So I think I'm going to stop here because I've been talking for a while, and I will record the next session here in a minute. And so this kind of introduces you to kind of the broad concepts.